Welcome to Realcast, the weekly roundup of the real asset markets. My name is Richard Betts, and I'm joined this week by Dan Innes and Nicole Dines. Dan, let's start with you. What have you been following this week?
This week I've been following that Boohoo and Debenhams story. That's the one that's been rocking the real estate and department store world, with that online fashion brand buying up the 242-year-old department store chain out of administration for just £55 million. The executive chairman of the Boohoo group, Milan Coima, he said the deal gave him ambition to create the UK's largest marketplace. He said that the acquisition of the Debenhams brand is a strategically significant one, as it represents a huge step that accelerates our ambition to become a leader, not just in e-commerce, but in new categories such as beauty, sport and homeware. Boohoo will not take any of its bricks and mortar stores as part of that deal, and they'll simply operate the brand. Boohoo themselves, they didn't pause for breath. They actually revealed they're eyeing up Dorothy Perkins, Wallace and Burton from the Arcadia breakup too. I mean, according to an article in Drapers, Debenhams' co-CEO Steve Cook, he's going to step away from the business from the end of January, and the remaining management team, led by the other CEO and CFO Mike Hazel, he's going to oversee the winding down process. So good and bad news there with Boohoo and Debenhams from a real asset perspective. On other news, we saw a major deal last week with Stockholm-based global investment firm EQT. They announced that they had agreed to buy the US-based Exeter property group in a 1.6 billion euro deal that its CEO, Christian Sinding, said would accelerate EQT's strategy to build a globally scaled real estate platform. Exeter, I mean, they focus on the acquisition, development and management of logistics and industrial, life science offices, resi properties. They currently have about $10 billion worth of assets under management. And that deal kind of broadens the private equity giant EQT's reach, really, with deals across Europe and North America. EQT's paid $800 million for new shares, plus $1 billion in cash. Quite a large move there over the last week. On Thursday, news came that Mapic announced its dates. For the first time, this year's Mapic will bring all three events, Mapic itself, Leisure Up, and the Happetite will now all be run out of Mapic in November in Cannes. My last story, following up on different stories over the last few months on Realcast, is, remember Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, her plans to turn the famous sort of Champs Elysees into an extraordinary garden in a £225 million plan. Well, EG ran a really interesting story last week entitled "What London's Struggling West End Could Learn from Paris." And people like Westminster Council's Elad Eisenstein, he told a panel discussion that London could really learn from Paris, referring to the recovery of London's Oxford Street as it kind of emerged from the pandemic. And the consensus is really that London needs the same level of ambition as Paris, really. We should be bringing people back together to create, a fantastic environment. There is a makeover plan for Oxford Street in the making, and everyone hopes that it's going to make it more sustainable and bring Londoners back to Europe's busiest shopping street. But there were some panel members who were pretty frank in their criticism of the area after it emerged, not just the Debenhams news, also Topshop and other major stores on Oxford Street closing. One of those major retailers, Selfridges, Tim Reed, who's head of asset management at Selfridges, he said, people talk about Oxford Street as being world class. At the moment, I think everybody has to accept that it's not quite the case at the moment, and that it's been declining for a few years, but still on the world stage, but there's a huge amount for them to do. So it's good to see everybody sort of galvanizing and getting behind Oxford Street.
I think it's interesting that look at Oxford Street and to see what may happen there, particularly also looking at Debenhams as a space, because of course a great deal of that the actual area there, the usable area is basement, which is interesting. I also noticed in the news this week that Oxford Properties had acquired M7 Real Estate, and again they were looking there to significantly advance their global logistics strategy. And as well as that, just on that logistics side, I noticed a story as well well, which was talking about a potential Dutch warehouse boom as UK firms are forced to invest abroad. So it could be that, in fact, there's a Brexit boom for the Dutch warehouse businesses. Nicole, what have you been following?
Well, Real Asset Media held its Outlook 2021 investment briefing looking at Europe and the UK in particular. And Tom Lee of Real Capital Analytics gave some figures on 2020. And beds and sheds came out on top, you will not be surprised to hear. But there were some interesting figures overall volumes fell by 44%, but there was a real pickup towards the end of the year in Q4, but particularly in December, which obviously led to some optimism looking ahead to 2021. But again, in 2020, Germany, by far the best performing country in Europe, with some 66.7 billion, due to, as we've said before, to a strong domestic investor base. And the UK is second with around 50, and it's quite the other way around. It's mainly cross-border capital, which has always been strong in London, will continue to do so. And there seemed to be a lot of optimism on London, despite the fact that obviously the year, as I said, started on a high, but then we had the third lockdown and prospects are very uncertain. So people are not quite sure. There's a huge contrast at the moment in the market between all the pent-up capital that's, waiting to get invested, and caution, a great deal of caution, which is obviously imposed on the market by the situation, the pandemic, that there's still no way out to be seen at the moment. All the panelists seemed to be very optimistic about the city. And Vanessa Muscara of Europa Capital said that London always reinvents itself. So there's a lot of optimism about the city. Talking of cities, Milan unveiled a really interesting new project. I'm sure everyone remembers the Porta Nuova development that really transformed the city in the last few years. And the same people responsible, Coima, have just announced a new project with a very similar but even more creative scheme. And it was a huge international competition with 359 architects that competed from 15 different countries. And in the end, it was given to one Italian architect, Stefano Boeri, and to Liz Diller, who was the person responsible for the High Line in Manhattan, which was obviously become incredibly popular. And it ticks all the boxes. It's regenerating some existing building, mixed use, residential and offices, but also creating a brand new 25-story residential tower, which will be completely covered in trees, like the vertical forest, which is already existing in Milan. So very much a green project, and it will be the equivalent of about 18,000 square feet of vegetation on this 25-story building. So another sort of sign that Milan is really wants to be put on the map as a very much and regeneration city and a green city.
Yeah, really interesting to see that project. I think interesting actually that the discussion in the briefing was quite positive, particularly Richard Pilkington of Kane International and Oliver Kummerfeld of Schroders around the office sector. But I noticed following the demise of the co-living company Quarters that we picked up last week in Realcast over in the US, co-working space seems to also be seeing closures over that, over in the US, with WeWork closing 4 more Washington, D.C. area co-working spaces, having already closed 3 offices before Christmas. And that follows on as well from earlier in the month, co-working provider Make Offices closing down. And I also noticed that Aviva was closing 3 UK offices and reducing the size of others as it makes flexible working a permanent feature beyond the pandemic. So quite a lot of interesting things happening in that area, I think. Thanks very much, Nicole. Thank you, Dan. Thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing next week for our regular roundup of the key themes in real assets.